My name is Gareth. A privilege to host you here at Free Church today. And maybe there's something in your life that you are struggling with, that you're trusting for God to move, to bring breakthrough, some kind of circumstance or situation, sickness. And like Amy said, God, He's still in the business of doing miracles. And we believe that where there's faith in the room and people alongside that stand and pray, that we can see God do incredible things. And whatever it is that you are facing and dealing with, we'd love to pray for you and with you. So at the end of the service, we'll make a moment for that and invite you to come forward to receive prayer for whatever it is that you may be facing. Many of you will be glad to see I survived last weekend with Amy being away for 5 nights. Did I tell you? 5 nights, longest she's ever been away. And I shared some of that story in the midst of her being away last week. And our tenant, who is here again today, she was in the service last week. I didn't know she was going to be there, but I told the story. So after church, she arrived with food for us. She's like, "Oh my goodness, why didn't you tell me that you were, battling so much?" And we made it. But thank you, appreciate that, and just love church and community and all those things. So we're heading towards Easter, the most significant weekend in the Christian calendar. And as we go, we're kind of tracking the story of Jesus in the build-up to Easter. And last week, we began unpacking the plot which was put together to take Jesus out. So a little bit of context, a little bit of recap. If you weren't here for last week's service, what's going on in the nation of Israel at that time is they're under Roman occupation. So in the front of everybody's minds is, when is someone going to come and save us from the Romans? It's happened before when we were under the Greek rulership. Someone broke us free. When's it going to happen? Who's the guy going to be? Where's the king? And everyone's anticipating someone is going to come and set them free from the Romans. At the same time, this rabbi from Nazareth is going around and he's healing people and he's raising the dead and he's causing quite a stir and gaining quite a following. And this is really getting up the nose of the religious leaders, the Pharisees of the time. So they set about this plot to put Jesus to death because they feel like this thing is getting out of control. I mean, how much good can you do, right? When someone eventually wants to take you out because you're doing so much good in the world. And this takes us up to a week before Easter. So what we're going to do is we're going to read a bunch of scripture today. So if you have a Bible with you, you can take it out. We're going to go to John chapter 12. I'm going to read you 27 verses out of John chapter 12, and then we're going to unpack it together. So this is more or less what is happening about 1 week before what we know as Easter and what the Jewish people referred to as Passover, which was looking back at the time that God set them free as a nation out of Israel. So, John chapter 12, verse 1. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany. Bethany is a town just outside of Jerusalem. Bethany, it could mean a couple of things. One of them is the town of unripe figs or the place of misery. You take your pick. Anyway, not a great place. And the reason why it was called the house of misery or the town of misery is because all the people that had sickness and disease would gather. It was like the place where they would go and live. So 6 days before the Passover, Jesus comes there and where Lazarus lived. Lazarus is the guy who Jesus in John chapter 11 raised from the dead. And he has 2 sisters, Mary and Martha. So here in Bethany, a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. And Martha served while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. And then Mary took about half a liter of pure nard, an expensive perfume. And she poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, he objected. "Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It is worth a year's wages." He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. "Leave her alone," Jesus replied. "It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." And meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there, and they came, not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well, for on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and beginning to believe in him. The next day, the great crowd that had come for the festival, they heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. So they took palm branches and went out to meet him, shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." That's the song we sang this morning. Blessed is the King of Israel. It's a reference to Psalm 118, verse 25 and 26. Blessed is the King of Israel. Jesus found a young donkey and sat upon it, as it is written, do not be afraid, daughter Zion. See, your king is coming, seated on a donkey's colt. At first, his disciples didn't understand all of this. John is very euphemistic in his writing. In other words, what he's saying is like, I did not get this when it was happening. But at first, his disciples didn't understand all this. Only after Jesus was glorified, in other words, once he'd been crucified, raised from the dead, and ascended to the Father in heaven, then did they realize that these things had been written about him and that these things had been done to him. Now the crowd that was with him, when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead, continued to spread the word. Many people, because they'd heard that he had performed the sign, went out to meet him. So the Pharisees said to one another, see, this is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone after him. What John is doing here, he's linking. Some of you will know the verse, John 3:16. It says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him will not perish and have eternal life. So he's putting in a play on words here. It's like the Pharisees are saying the whole world has gone after him. Everyone Jesus has come to save has gone after him. Verse 20, now there were some Greeks among those who went up to worship at the festival. And they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, with a request. So they said, we would like to see Jesus. So Philip went to tell Andrew, and Philip in turn told Jesus. And Jesus replied, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly, I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Anyone who loves their life will lose it, and anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, my servant also will be. My Father will honor the one who serves me. So I want to unpack this in three scenes. And the first scene is the scene of perfume. The second one, the scene of palms. And the third one, a paradox that Jesus shares. So the scene of perfume. Jesus gathers together with his friends, with his disciples, in the town of Bethany. Imagine that you were Jesus, or with Jesus, that you were there in this moment. Jesus has been outlawed. There's a plot underway to kill him. People are seeking to take his life. The telltales are going to the Pharisees and saying, Jesus is here, Jesus is there. And this could be just the last Sabbath moment that Jesus has together with his closest friends. So it's him, the disciples, Lazarus, who's been raised from the dead, Mary and Martha, the two sisters, which you've met before if you've read the Gospels. And he gathers into their house. And I imagine they all like hunched around this table. I don't know how big the rooms were at that time, but there's probably at least 20 or 30 people in the room. And they're having a celebration dinner for Jesus because he's brought Lazarus back from the dead. I mean, I don't know what kind of celebration dinners you've had before. You've got married, you've had a birthday, you've graduated, you've made it through the week. Let's have a celebration dinner. Like this is a significant moment. Like Lazarus was dead and now he's back, so let's have a dinner and invite everyone around and get Jesus there. And Jesus is the guest of honor. And could you imagine how the conversation is going? I mean, just put yourself in there, and the candles are burning, and you're kind of all hunched in the room, and like, tell us again, Lazarus, what it was like. You were in the tomb, and then what happened? And it was like, well, I had these grave clothes, and they were wrapped around my head, but then, I didn't really know what was going on, but then I heard this voice, and said, Lazarus, come out, and this power came over me, and so I walked out, and I still couldn't see, but it was getting lighter, and suddenly, like, I took it off my eyes, and suddenly I saw you guys, you were there, and you were all standing like this, oh my goodness, can you believe it? And then people were coming up to me and touching, did it really happen? They're like, oh my goodness, Lazarus, tell us again, what happened? Hey, did you see what that one guy did when he saw you? Like, he fainted, he totally fainted. And then, tell us again, Lazarus, tell us, Jesus, how did you do that? That was incredible, that's amazing. And then all these smells are coming through because Martha's one room removed, she's in the kitchen, she's preparing the food, and the guys are getting hungry, and Martha, that smells incredible, and the conversation's going, and they're joking about what could be happening. But I imagine within Jesus is this kind of bittersweet emotion. He's with his closest friends, but yet he knows what's coming in less than a week's time. And he's been trying to tell them and sharing it that he has to lay down his life, but no one seems to be catching on. They keep like, just no, Jesus is never going to happen, not you, how could it be? And there's this euphoria of the moment, celebration of Lazarus, and Jesus is there with them, and everyone's leaning in, but I imagine like deep down, there's this kind of, this anticipation of what's to come. And then it gets to a moment where there's suddenly a break in conversation and everything goes quiet. I mean, I'm reading into this a little bit, but I imagine this is how it would have happened. And suddenly there's a different fragrance in the room. And it's not Martha's food in the kitchen. And it's this incredible fragrance, aroma begins to like filter through the room, and everyone kind of stops and looks around because they crowded in there and they didn't have chairs at the tables like we do. Everyone kind of lies around the table, and generally it was the men that were there, and women weren't usually welcome at table in these environments or in this culture, and they wonder, where's the smell coming from? And they look, and all of a sudden see that Mary is at the feet of Jesus with this expensive bottle of perfume, and she's pouring it on his feet. And it's filling the room with this incredible fragrance. And it says, John writes, about 1/2 liter of this expensive perfume. It could have cost a year's wages. So I went to look because I thought, hey, it would be cool if we could get some here today. Maybe, the Ezra team could put some in the candles and we could have spikenard candles. So I Googled it. This is how much it costs today. 699 Rand for 10 mils. That's 70 grand a liter. So what she did, she took 35 grand in today's terms worth of perfume and broke it and put it on Jesus' feet. I mean, that's more than dropping like your bottle of Dior, right? Which you could just go to duty free and get another one. This is a lot of money. Judas objects. He's like, why couldn't you have sold that and give the money to the poor? And John puts it in as the narrator because everyone around the table, except for Jesus, no one suspected Judas of anything at that time. So he's like helping us look back, like this is the guy, this is the betrayer, this is the one who was close to Jesus, but was hiding the motivations of his heart. So he was interested in what he could skim off the top, had that money being sold. And it's likely that in Mary's family, like this was kind of her inheritance. It was something maybe that she was keeping one day for her family or family burials or something. This 1/2 liter of perfume, it gets harvested from a plant in the Himalayas. It's a very, very expensive perfume. And she pours it on the feet of Jesus. But not only does she do that, she unties her hair. She lets her hair down. We miss that. We read it. Oh, she let her hair down. Is that where it comes from? Let your hair down. I don't know. But culturally, in the ancient Hebrew culture, if a woman was to let their hair down, it was a sign of immorality. It was actually embarrassing. It was not done. You never do that in public. If you were married, you could let your hair down at home and it was just like for you and your husband. But if you go out in public, your hair's covered up. You never let your hair down. And Jesus has been able to do something to create a safe space for Mary of Bethany to come and to feel so safe and secure in this environment to let her hair down to the point of embarrassment and bring this extravagant gift of worship to the feet of Jesus and put it upon his feet. And this proximity to Jesus, she seems to have picked up on something that everyone else has missed. She's anointing his feet for a burial which is to come. And all the disciples have been with him. They're just like, yeah, go Jesus, nothing's ever going to happen to you. But she's anticipating like something is going to happen. And Judas puts a judgment upon her. And I imagine the rest of the people in the room are going like, oh my goodness, Mary, what are you doing? I mean, have you had those moments where you're at table with people and someone says something or does something and you're just like, well, that was awkward. And you're just like, no one knows what to say or how to recover from that. I think that's what's going on in the moment. Everyone's like, oh, can you believe Mary's uncovered her hair and she's putting all this stuff on Jesus' feet? Like, what is going on? Judas freaks out and Jesus gently rebukes him and says, leave her alone, because you'll always have the poor, but you'll not always have me. And the rabbis at the time had this debate about which was the better thing to do, to give money to the poor or to prepare bodies for burial. And the reason why they believed in preparing bodies for burial, because there was a belief or an argument that if a body was prepared correctly, then that would lead toward a resurrection, which would come in time. So Jesus is putting like this massive hint down for them. He said, you'll always have the poor, but let her prepare my body for the burial. In other words, like the resurrection is about to happen. And everyone seems to miss it, except for Mary. But what an incredible, incredible picture of what it is to worship Jesus. That someone can shrug off the criticism of those closest to her to the point of embarrassment and bring a gift of extravagance of worship to the feet of Jesus and be secure and accepted in that place. And there's an invitation for you to do that, to come into the presence of Jesus, carrying your shame and your brokenness to the point of embarrassing yourself, to do what is not culturally accepted, to do what is not normal, what those closest to you might judge you for and say, how could you do that? How could you spend that much? But there's something beautiful about this moment that happens that Mary shows us of what it looks like to worship Jesus in a personal space. And the reason why she can do that is because this is who Jesus is. He's a person who creates a safe space for you to come in your brokenness, to encounter him face to face, where you forget about everyone else around you. We say, you know what, I'm going to let my hair down, and I'm going to bring this, even though it cost me a year's wages, I'm going to give it to Jesus because I believe that he's worth it. And she's celebrating that her brother's back from the dead, and Jesus has done that, but she's also, I think, more celebrating the revelation that she had in the previous chapter where Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Like, she gets something of this. And I think the enemy traps many of us and many of you in different areas of your life where you're afraid to bring an extravagance to Jesus because of what the voices of people will say. And I think what Mary shows us here is actually we should be free to the point of embarrassment to worship Jesus with everything that we have. Because he looks upon us and he says, leave her alone. Leave her alone. You come to Jesus with that extravagance and that to the point of embarrassment, and the answer of Jesus is leave her alone. This is a good thing. This is a beautiful thing. Don't put a cost to it. Maybe that's for some of you today, that there's been some restriction holding you back, and this beautiful picture of worship. Scene 1, perfume. Scene 2, palms. The next day, Jesus leaves Bethany, and he heads into the city of peace, Jerusalem. And the word gets out that he's on his way. Jerusalem at the time, probably 3 million people gathered there for the Passover feast, which is coming. Jews came from everywhere, descended upon the city. Ancient Jerusalem, 3 million people lining the streets. The outlaw is coming to town. So they go and cut palm branches, and they bring them, they line the streets, and they're waving the palm branches, and they're singing like the song we sang out of Psalm 118, verse 26. Hosanna, which is the Hebrew word, it means save us now. Hosanna, save us now. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And they're linking back to Psalms, this prophecy that was written 1,000 years before. And they're singing it, and they're declaring it, and they're shouting it over him. But there's one thing which is a little confusing, because palm branches didn't go with Passover. Passover was a festival which they celebrated when God had freed the Israelite people from Egypt, like hundreds or thousands of years before. And every year they celebrated Passover to remember how God had delivered them from Egypt. But the palm branches come from another festival called Hanukkah, which happens at a different time of year. So what's going on in this moment is kind of like having mince pies at Easter or Easter eggs at Christmas. Like palm branches and Passover, they just don't go together. It's the wrong season. And the reason why they did this is because the way that people of that time would welcome a conquering king was they would line the streets and wave palm branches at them. And in 164 BC, there was a guy called Judas Maccabees, a Jewish person who rose up and led a revolt against the Greek occupation of Israel and successfully overthrew the Greeks and restored the temple. And what they did when Judas came back into town is they waved palm branches at him and they celebrated, and they said the same thing. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So with this idea of the Roman occupation over the Jewish people, everyone anticipating the Messiah, the Savior is going to come. Here comes the outlaw, the guy who's been raising the dead. All the talk of the town is going. The people are lining the streets. And while the Pharisees, the religious leaders, are in the backdrop going like, oh my goodness, this is getting out of control. This is getting us nowhere. The whole world is going after him. The people are going, here comes our king. Here comes our king. Here comes our king. Here comes our king. Blessed is he who comes in the name. I mean, could you imagine there? Some of you are not people in that sense. Like you don't like crowds, 3 million people in the city and everyone shouting along the streets. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. But the thing is, he's riding a donkey. Now don't miss this, because a donkey in that culture was actually an animal of nobility. I mean, I think Shrek has sort of wrecked it for us, right? But back then, donkeys were considered like this is a noble animal. And if a king was going out to war, a king would ride a horse or ride in a chariot. But if a king was coming in peace, the king would ride a donkey. So Jesus comes into the city of peace, riding an animal of peace. He's a declaration of peace. The outlaw, everyone fighting against him from the religious side, but he comes with a message and declaration of peace. I come riding upon a donkey. But not just that. In Zechariah 9 verse 9, which was written 500 years before, the prophet wrote this passage about the king who would one day come into Jerusalem riding on a donkey. And in Revelation, there's a verse that says the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. What that means is that the witness of Jesus, the testimony of Jesus, is the fact that all the prophecies that are written throughout the Old Testament all tie together and point to one thing. So he climbs upon this donkey as a declaration of peace. He comes into the city to fulfill what was prophesied hundreds of years before by the prophet, so that anyone who's paying attention goes like, this is the guy. This is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. But he comes in a completely unexpected way. He doesn't come on a horse and chariot. He doesn't come with weapons, but actually comes into the city of peace. And the prophecy in Zechariah is all about disarming the city of the weapons of war and bringing peace. So what he's doing, it's this picture, this beautiful picture of the King of Peace is coming in, but in humility, upon an animal of peace. And this is what happens in the crowd. There's two crowds. The one that's shouting, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And if you're listening carefully, there's another crowd there who's going around saying, let me tell you what I witnessed. I saw Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead. And because of the testimony and the story of what people are saying, others are coming to the crowd. And in the Hebrew culture, there wasn't a word for thank you. If someone did something for you, you wouldn't say to them, thank you to the person. They didn't have that language. What they would say is, let me tell you about that person. Let me tell you about our tenant who brought me dinner and the kids last Sunday. Instead of saying thank you, that's how they would do it. So do you see the connection that when you tell a story of what you've witnessed of God do in your life, it's the same as saying thank you to him. It's an act of worship. So I want to say to each of you that your story matters. Your testimony of what Jesus, we sang about that. I've witnessed it. I've witnessed it. When you tell the stories of what Jesus has done in your life, it draws a crowd for people to come and sing together and shout praises. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. And some of you need to be released from a fear of telling your story. But when you tell your story, let me put it this way. On the other side of your story are people waiting to meet the King of Peace. And no story is insignificant. Hey, let me tell you about how I've seen Jesus heal. Let me tell you about how I've seen Jesus bring breakthrough. Let me tell you about how I've seen Jesus restore marriages. Let me tell you about how I've seen Jesus bring financial provision. Let me tell you a story. Let me tell you a story about Jesus. Now, I want to encourage you that your story matters, that you have a story to tell. And for some of you, it's time for the redeemed of the Lord to tell your story. However small you may think it I'm telling you, there's incredible power in your story. So scene 1, Perfume. Scene 2, Psalms. Scene 3 is Paradox. So Jesus entered into the city. He's come for the Passover. And I imagine after that, we don't know exactly where, but I imagine they go into a room or a space where it's just him and the disciples. And in my mind, like playing it out, this is kind of like mafia scene, where the boss is in the room and the disciples are like sentries. Like, we got to guard this guy because, the religious leaders are out to get him. So the Greeks arrive, and the Greeks are truth seekers. They were always interested in learning new things and what's the latest and greatest. And so they come and they arrive in Jerusalem and they've heard about Jesus, so they go to Philip and they say, hey, we want to see Jesus. So Philip goes to Andrew. He's like the next bodyguard. And together they go to Jesus. And Jesus, hey, there's these Greeks outside. They want to see you. And Jesus says, well, bring them in. Except he doesn't. So these Greeks are waiting outside and Jesus stands up. And he goes in and he launches into this like mini parable, and he brings in this paradox, and he says, the time has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Unless a seed dies, there will not be a great harvest. And if someone wants to gain their life, actually they have to give up their life. And if someone wants to be honored, the way to do that is to follow me and to serve. And when we think about that, like there seems to be common sense in that, but I imagine the Greeks like still waiting outside, like, is Jesus going to show? Like we never find out what happens to the Greeks. So they just stand outside waiting for the rest of time. But really what he's doing, this is the significance of it, is he's up until then been working predominantly with the Jewish people, revelation to them. But the statement that he makes about that one seed has to die for there to be an incredible harvest, he's speaking about the way this is going to happen is as I give my life, like not just the Jews, but the Greeks and the Gentiles and the whole world, actually this is going to become the harvest. This is going to become the harvest. Through this act of sacrificial love, by giving my life on the cross, this is the seed that dies. And unless this happens, and so it's true in the natural, that when a seed dies, what comes next is that there's a fruitful harvest. But then there's an invitation. So Jesus shares the story. This is how it's going to happen. This is how the gospel, these guys have come, they want to see me. This is how it's going to happen, is I'm going to die. And then there's going to be a harvest of all people, all nations. Like this is the way it's going to happen. This is the way that the systems of the world are going to be defeated and conquered. Is that I'm going to give my life, and out of that a harvest is going to come. And the invitation for those of you listening in, the invitation, those leaning into the story, wanting to be part of this, Jesus goes on and he says, well, this is how you follow, is you're willing to give your life up and take a hold of mine. Because if you love this life, like you're not going to gain the next, but if you hate, and that's a strong word, if you hate this life, that's how you take hold of eternal life. We've got to temper that. What does hate mean? It doesn't mean like, oh my goodness, I hate my life so much right now. It means I prioritize it less. I lessen this to take a hold of the greater. And if you want to be honored, Jesus says, then the way is that you follow him and you serve, and God will honor those who serve. And this is the paradox of following Jesus, is many of us, we want the abundant life and the breakthrough that Jesus promises, and we want all of that, but we're unwilling to die to ourselves and to lay something down. But the centrality of the gospel message is for life to come, for harvest to come, for the next to come, is there has to be in us a willingness that I'm going to lay my agenda down, and my ambitions down, and my life down, and I'm going to take up the mantle and the life of Christ. So of these three scenes, there's three invitations to worship. And the first one is for you to come into the presence of Jesus in this personal space. We forget about everyone else in the room and those who know you and those who know you the well. Sometimes those barriers are the hardest to overcome because you're worried about what is my family going to think? What are my friends going to think? What are those closest to me going to think? But you bring whatever it is, whatever extravagance you have to the feet of Jesus, and you put it upon him because he's worth it, to the point of embarrassing yourself. You say, forget about everyone else because this is just about me and Jesus. And that's the invitation that he has for you, because he creates that safe space, a place where there's peace for your soul, where you can come in your brokenness with your shame and all your faults and failures, and you can literally let your hair down before him and be at his feet, and he looks upon you and say, leave her alone, leave him alone. This is a good and beautiful thing. And there's an invitation for some of you to tell your story amongst the crowds. And as you tell the story of what Jesus has done in your life, so it draws a crowd. And more people come to hear the King and meet the King of Peace. And for some of you, there's an invitation to lay something of yourself down and say, I want to take a hold of this abundant life that Jesus has for me. And I realize there's a paradox in following him, is I've got to let go of much of what I trust in, depend on, hold on to, and all of those things, and release that so that I can take up this example of what Jesus says.